Harry and I grew up together in a small town in Indiana. He was always the quiet, introverted type, the kind of guy who kept to himself but had a heart of gold. He could easily spend an entire afternoon lost in a book or tinkering with some random gadget he found. We were an unlikely pair, him the shy, brainy one and me the loud, outgoing personality. But somehow it worked. We connected over our shared love of video games, spending countless weekends trying to conquer the latest releases. After high school, I enlisted in the military. Having been involved in JROTC throughout school, it felt like a natural progression. Harry considered joining too, but his dad shut that idea down hard. The early 2000s were a tough time, especially with the wars in the Middle East raging. Harry's dad was determined to keep him safe from all that chaos. He didn't want his son becoming just another name on the evening news. Looking back, I can't say I blame him. I lost more friends than I care to remember in those conflicts. If Harry had joined, he could have been one of them. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, and Harry's path veered into a different kind of darkness. Now, he's serving over 20 years in prison. All of it because of a woman who dragged him into a world of trouble. I often think about whether I could have changed things. Maybe if I'd stepped in sooner when he first started talking about her. Harry called me near the end of my military service, all excited about a new girl he'd met. I could sense something wasn't right, but I didn't say anything. I kept quiet, thinking it wasn't my place. Now, I can't help but wonder if I'm partly to blame for not saying something when it mattered. 8 years in the military passed in the blink of an eye. When I came back, everything felt foreign. I'd received an honorable discharge after spending most of my time in the Middle East, and all I wanted was to reconnect with my old friend. I called Harry, hoping to catch up over a drink. He'd been busy and had turned me down once already, so getting him to meet up was no easy feat. We used to hang out whenever I'd get a break from duty, but those visits had become less frequent over the years. Harry's life had taken off in ways I never imagined. He was now running a successful manufacturing company specializing in high-tech components. From what I'd heard, business was booming. After high school, Harry went to college, got his degree in bioenergy engineering, and somehow turned his small startup into a $1-million enterprise in just a few short years. Meanwhile, I was back home, jobless, with a resume that hardly screamed, high-paying career. 8 years in the military didn't exactly prepare me for civilian life, and I was struggling to find my footing. Felt like I was starting all over again. Harry, on the other hand, was riding high on success. I didn't resent him for it, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little. He'd always been the smart one, the one with the plan, while I was left trying to figure out my next move. That's why I was so eager to meet up with him. I wanted to pitch the idea of working together, this time at his company. We talked about it years ago when he first started the business, back when I was still overseas. The idea of teaming up again had been in the back of my mind ever since. Now, more than ever, I needed a fresh start, and I hoped Harry might be the answer to that. Back during my military days, Harry and I had discussed the possibility of me joining his company once I got out. I figured I could help with customer relations and sourcing parts from overseas, especially since he traveled frequently to Asia to find vendors for the components his team needed. We talked about it several times, and I genuinely thought I could offer something valuable. So, when I showed up at the bar that day, I was hopeful. Sure, he'd flaked on me before, but this time I was determined to make it count. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted his car right behind mine. Even back then, his business was doing well enough that he was driving the sports car he'd always dreamed of owning. I won't say what kind of car it was to keep things vague, but let's just say it was the type that turned heads. Seeing it there gave me a jolt of excitement. It had been 2 years since we'd last seen each other, and I was looking forward to catching up. When Harry walked in, I noticed he'd put on about 40 pounds since the last time I'd seen him. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, and right away, I could tell that bars weren't really his thing. Harry had never been much of a drinker, which was in stark contrast to my own habits that had developed over the years. Still, he agreed to meet me, and I took that as a good sign. Or so I thought. As we settled in, I tried to steer the conversation toward the job we'd talked about years ago, but Harry skillfully avoided the topic every time I brought it up. Instead, he seemed much more interested in talking about his wife, Angela. a woman he'd met in China and brought to the US on a spousal visa. About a year earlier, Harry had called me to tell me about Angela shortly after she'd arrived in the States. They'd met 2 years earlier while Harry was in China, scouting suppliers for a component he designed for one of his latest products. Angela had been his translator and liaison on that trip, and before long, she was working for him remotely from China. After about a year, she made the move to the US. They had a quick courthouse wedding in China, but Angela was determined to have a full, traditional wedding experience in the US, something she dreamed of since she was a little girl. Harry, being the socially awkward, geeky guy he is, tends to fall head over heels for any woman who shows him attention. I'd warned him about this before. It never ended well. Naturally, I felt the need to give him some advice about this relationship because something about Angela didn't sit right with me. I found it strange how quickly she seemed to gain control over his business. According to Harry, they'd split everything 50-50, but there was something about the way he mentioned it that raised a red flag for me. I asked him why they hadn't had the wedding yet, and he told me it was because her parents were having visa issues. She wanted them to be there, and the delays were making it impossible to set a date. I wasn't buying it. I told him flat out, if I were you, she would have given up that celibacy by now. Harry didn't take that well at all. He got defensive, listing all the ways she was special, how she was a great business partner, smart, beautiful, and hardworking. I warned him about giving her too much control over his business, pointing out that plenty of women possess those qualities, and she wasn't exactly a rare gem. Harry didn't like my skepticism one bit. I could tell he was getting irritated, so I tried to steer the conversation back toward the job opportunity. But by that point, the damage had been done. His mood shifted, and it was clear he wasn't as interested in discussing it anymore. It felt like the Harry I used to know had vanished. Maybe it was the wealth, or maybe he just didn't want to hear my opinions anymore. By the time we wrapped up, he half-heartedly promised to think about the job idea and get back to me after reevaluating his available positions. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the friend I'd once known was gone. In his place was this business-minded guy, completely infatuated with a woman who seemed to have him wrapped around her finger. That's when I made a promise to myself. If he offered me a job, I'd keep my mouth shut, go along with whatever he wanted, and just be a yes man. I had to look out for myself. 3 days later, Harry called and invited me to his place. I prepared for that meeting like it was a job interview because, in many ways, it had been years since I'd felt nervous about seeing him, but I really wanted that job. I knew better than to say anything that might set him off again. People change, I thought. Life experiences, money, and all kinds of other things can turn your closest friends into strangers. I wasn't sure if I'd meet Angela that night, but I figured I might since they lived together. I arrived at Harry's place around 9 or 10 p.m. It was a nice home, in a good part of town, nothing too flashy, but definitely a step up from where I was. At the time, I was still living with my parents, driving around in an old clunker that wasn't worth much. So yeah, the job offer meant a lot to me. When I walked in, Angela greeted me politely, but there was something a little distant about her. I could see why Harry was so infatuated with her. She was stunning, beautiful, graceful, and carried herself with an air of propriety. She even made us Chinese food for dinner, and after we ate, the three of us moved into the living room with glasses of wine to talk business. Harry offered me the position of vice president for customer relations and sourcing. I'd have 2 employees reporting to me, making me the 3rd highest ranking person in the company, right after Harry and Angela. As we talked, I started to get a better understanding of their business. At the time, they had about 10 employees, most of whom focused on manufacturing medical equipment and components for various industries. They engineered and assembled the parts, sourcing all the components from Asia. Their business model was extremely profitable. They patented parts that their customers needed for years, effectively becoming the sole supplier and controlling the prices without competition. Quickly became clear that Angela played a much bigger role in the company than I'd originally thought. She was in charge of the supply chain, customer relations, marketing, and even hiring. Harry, as the company president, focused on engineering, quality control, and patents. So, at least initially, my role would be more about supporting Angela than working directly with Harry. Angela's English was good, though her Chinese accent was still noticeable. She was only 25, just a couple of years younger than us, but she was sharp, well-connected with suppliers and customers, and seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Harry mentioned that they were fast-tracking my hiring because he and Angela were planning a business trip to China and Vietnam in a few months. They needed someone to hold down the fort while they were away, and I was more than ready to step into that role. Harry also floated the idea of me joining Angela on her next trip to China. He thought it would be a great opportunity for me to immerse myself in the business and meet their suppliers. Angela made those trips about every 2 months, so being involved in that side of the business was critical for my role. As we drank more wine, both Harry and Angela seemed to loosen up. Looking back, I can see that Angela was putting on a bit of an act, especially around Harry. Her more outgoing personality would occasionally peek through, but she kept it restrained. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Even if I had noticed, I wouldn't have said anything. Harry was far too sensitive when it came to his wife. About a week later, I officially began my on-the-job training. I was given my own office and quickly started learning the ropes. A couple of weeks in, we were gearing up for a major manufacturing expo in Las Vegas. It was going to attract a lot of clients from the medical industry, making it a prime opportunity to showcase the company's capabilities. Harry, Angela, another colleague, and I were all set to attend the 3-day event. We'd rented a booth to present our products, and I felt lucky to be included in the trip. It was my first real chance to get involved with the company outside the office. The expo was scheduled from Wednesday to Friday, and we were planning to fly in on Tuesday. Depending on how our meetings went and any free time we had, we might have gotten a chance to explore the city. We rolled into Vegas late Tuesday evening, and all 4 of us checked into the same hotel. My main focus that night was getting the marketing materials ready and setting up our booth, so I didn't expect much downtime to see the city. However, I had a few questions that needed clarification, so I decided to stop by Harry and Angela's suite to get their input. When I knocked, Harry let me in and mentioned that Angela had stepped out for a bit. He was reviewing some designs on his laptop, but since the questions were more in Angela's wheelhouse, he couldn't really help me. After wrapping up with Harry, I thought I'd try to track down Angela. Knowing Harry, he wasn't the type to be hanging around a bar for a drink, so I figured she was either handling business or meeting someone. I wandered into the casino downstairs and spotted Angela at the bar, chatting with a man I didn't recognize. As soon as she saw me, she waved me over and invited me to join them. I sat down, and to my surprise, they immediately started asking my opinion on a horse race being shown on one of the screens. I had no clue about horse racing, and it felt like they were just trying to distract me. Maybe because I'd caught Angela in a situation she didn't want me to see. At first, I didn't think much of it. She could have just been networking, which was the whole point of us being in Vegas. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. She seemed to be trying too hard to act casual. Angela and the man were sharing drinks, and there was definitely a hint of flirtation between them. When I showed up, the guy quickly made his exit, clearly disappointed. I decided to steer the conversation back to work and asked Angela about the questions I'd originally come to discuss. By then, she had a few drinks in her, which made her a little more talkative than usual. We started chatting, and before long we were talking about her relationship with Harry. To my surprise, she didn't have a whole lot of nice things to say. She complained that Harry was too focused on work, overly critical, and had rigid expectations of how people should behave. I listened without offering my thoughts on Harry. I'd learned the hard way that offering opinions about their relationship was a bad idea. During our conversation, Angela opened up about her background. She told me she was born in China, the only child of her parents, and raised in a strict, traditional household. However, her wealthy uncle, her father's younger brother, helped her get a good education. She traveled to the U.S. several times as a tourist before eventually graduating college early. She had worked as a liaison between Chinese and foreign companies, and that's how she met Harry. We talked for about an hour, getting to know each other better as the bar slowly emptied. To my surprise, I started feeling a strange chemistry between us, something I wasn't expecting. To break the tension, I jokingly suggested we should invite Harry to join us, but Angela just laughed and told me he was already asleep. This isn't his scene, she said with a chuckle. And she was right, Harry wasn't exactly into late-night bar outings. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the vibe between us was shifting. The flirtation was becoming more noticeable, and the alcohol wasn't helping. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to clear my head. We hadn't crossed any lines, but it was definitely getting close. Maybe I was the one pushing it. I didn't want to mess things up. Harry was my best friend, my boss, and this was his wife. I reminded myself that I couldn't risk it all for this. When I came back, another man had approached Angela, trying to chat her up. As soon as he saw me return, he backed off, looking a little uncomfortable. I couldn't help but really look at Angela again. She was undeniably stunning, easily a 9 or 10. I made a lighthearted comment about the music and suggested we should dance, even though the background tunes were just bad elevator music. She chuckled and told me it was a slow song, not really her style. She liked R&B, EDM, and house music, anything with a beat. I half-joked about hitting up a Vegas club, and to my surprise, she was familiar with some of the popular spots, rattling off names like she'd been there before. I asked how she knew about them, and she casually mentioned that she'd come to Vegas with a friend for a birthday celebration, exploring the city's nightlife. It wasn't just a one-time visit. She'd been to Vegas multiple times on business as well. It felt like she was showing off, like she wanted me to think she was more experienced than Harry realized. The more I thought about it, the more I started seeing her as a savvy, manipulative woman who knew exactly what she was doing, using Harry as a stepping stone while keeping her true intentions hidden from him. We decided to check out one of the clubs she'd mentioned, standing in a long line to get inside. By this point, we were both tipsy, and the flirtation between us only intensified. Once we were in, things escalated quickly. We danced close, our hands touching like we were a couple. She suggesting we head back to the hotel before Harry started wondering where she was. It was already around 1 a.m. and she was right. I had an early start the next day, and it wasn't smart to push things any further. We left the club and grabbed a cab. In the back seat, things heated up again. Before I knew it, Angela had already tilted her head and started doing something I hadn't expected. She didn't seem to care that the driver was sneaking glances at us through the rearview mirror. Just a few blocks from the hotel, the driver half-jokingly told us to cut it out and get a room. Angela stopped, and we composed ourselves as we pulled up to the hotel. Back inside, we rode the elevator up to our floor. For a moment, I thought she might come to my room, but instead, she simply wished me good night and went into the room she shared with Harry. I stayed up that night, my mind racing with what had almost happened. The next morning, I was woken by a knock on my door. It was the colleague who had come with us, reminding me that we needed to get to the expo early to set up our booth. It was already past 7 a.m., so I quickly got dressed and headed downstairs, feeling nervous about how Angela would act when I saw her again. When I saw Harry and Angela having breakfast in the hotel restaurant, Angela greeted me like nothing had happened. I didn't linger, though. We were in a rush, and I told them I was heading to the venue to set up at the expo. The rest of the day, I focused on promoting our products and trying to stay busy, but I couldn't help glancing at Angela every now and then. She wouldn't make eye contact, and it felt like she was intentionally avoiding me. I started to wonder if the alcohol had played a bigger role than I realized. Maybe she regretted it, felt guilty, or just wanted to forget it ever happened. Later that day, Angela left the expo early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Harry mentioned that she might have been robbed on the street before the expo, which had shaken her up a bit, though she didn't offer many details. It made me wonder if there was more going on than I realized. I wanted to talk to Angela, clear the air, but I didn't get the chance. That night, I went to the hotel bar hoping to find her, but she wasn't there. The next day at the expo, Harry was busy meeting with a customer, and our other colleague had stepped away, leaving just Angela and me alone at the booth. I knew I needed to say something, but I couldn't find the words. When I finally managed to speak, I fumbled through an apology. Angela's response was cold and dismissive. "I know it won't happen again," she said, not even glancing at me, turning back to her work as though nothing had happened. It was as if that whole night had been erased from her mind, or at least, that's how she wanted it to seem. I couldn't tell if she was truly indifferent or if she was burying her feelings about what had happened. The tension between us broke when a customer approached the booth with questions, snapping us both back into business mode. After that, I felt a bit relieved that Angela's reaction hadn't been explosive. She'd shut down the conversation, but at least it hadn't escalated into something worse. Still, it was awkward, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to crossing a line I could never uncross. When I returned to the hotel that night, I felt slightly better than I had the previous day. And for the first time in a while, I managed to get a decent night's sleep. The last day of the expo was supposed to be a half day at the booth, followed by meetings with potential customers. My colleague and I spent most of the morning coordinating the return of our products. Harry and Angela visited our booth a couple of times, but spent the majority of the day in private meetings with clients. By then, my interactions with Angela were back to normal, professional, polite, and devoid of any awkwardness. It was as if the events from 2 nights ago had never happened. At the end of the day, we all shared a ride back to the airport. I sat in the front seat while Harry, Angela, and the other colleagues sat in the back, chatting and laughing as if everything were perfectly normal. I glanced at them in the rearview mirror and saw Harry and Angela smiling together. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief, as if I'd narrowly avoided a disaster. I realized how close I had come to completely ruining everything. Shortly after the trip, Harry informed me that the planned business trip to China had been postponed for reasons I couldn't quite recall. I felt relieved. I didn't want to spend more time alone with Angela. Not after what had almost happened. Meanwhile, Harry and Angela began planning the traditional white wedding she'd always dreamed of. Her parents had finally arrived in the US from China, and the ceremony was set. Most of Harry's employees, including myself, attended the wedding. By this time, my relationship with Harry had shifted. We were no longer best friends. The dynamic had evolved into one of boss and employee. I was earning more money than I'd ever thought possible, and with the company's rapid growth, my income was set to double within a year. The business was thriving, and we expanded quickly, hiring 6 more salaried employees. Our team now consisted of 3 managers, including myself and 2 others, plus Harry, Angela, 3 engineers, and over 20 hourly workers. Despite all the progress, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about Harry and Angela's marriage. She had an alarming level of control over both their household and the company. I kept my interactions with her strictly professional, avoiding anything that might remind us of what had almost happened. I was determined to focus on my work and family, not wanting to jeopardize either my marriage or my career. Fast forward 2 years, and things were going exceptionally well for the business. I was now earning around $250,000 annually, and my wife and I were expecting our second child. One evening, out of the blue, Harry called and suggested we meet at a bar. It struck me as unusual. He rarely drank, and we hadn't hung out in a long time. Naturally, I felt anxious about the meeting, wondering if the past with Angela was finally catching up to me. As I drove to the bar, my mind raced with all sorts of scenarios. Maybe Harry had found out. Maybe I was about to lose my job. Or worse. But when I arrived and saw Harry sitting there, it was clear this meeting wasn't about me. Harry looked troubled, and it didn't take long for him to open up. He was in a bad spot and needed someone to talk to. Harry explained that his relationship with Angela had been strained for a while. Over the years, she tried to isolate him from his friends and family, including me. Her parents, who had come to the US for their wedding, were still living with them, refusing to leave. They were trying to control how their 2-year-old daughter was being raised, which had caused significant tension. Harry struggled with raising his daughter in a multicultural household, especially with Angela's parents constantly undermining him. I felt deeply for Harry. It wasn't fair for his in-laws to take advantage of his mild-mannered nature. I wanted to tell him to stand up for himself, to demand they leave. But Harry said Angela had already agreed to send them back to China in a few weeks. Still, it was clear their relationship was suffering. Angela seemed to support her parents' presence, believing their strict upbringing had shaped her into the person she was, and that they provided stability for their daughter while she and Harry frequently traveled for business. As we continued talking, Harry admitted that he and Angela hadn't been intimate in over 4 months. She always had excuses. Work, stress, their daughter, or sheer exhaustion. He'd even suggested she become a stay-at-home mom, but Angela's ambitions didn't align with that idea. Harry wanted a simpler family life, more kids, less drama. But Angela's desire for control over both their family and the business seemed to be growing. I asked him if he'd ever considered divorce, suggesting it might allow him to protect his assets and maintain a relationship with his daughter without interference from Angela's family. Harry admitted that he hadn't seriously considered it and hadn't spoken to a lawyer. Instead, he was hoping to suggest marriage counseling to Angela. I didn't discourage him, but I advised him to have a backup plan. I even suggested he start monitoring her activities, checking her phone, tracking her movements, maybe even installing a GPS in her car. Harry looked at me like I was crazy. He dismissed the idea, insisting Angela wasn't the type to have an affair. In that moment, I realized it was probably best to keep my thoughts to myself. Harry seemed blind to what, to me, was obvious. Angela might be hiding something. It was as if he was too smart for his own good, unable to see what was right in front of him. As Harry poured out his troubles, a sudden hailstorm hit outside. The hailstones grew larger, pounding against the bar windows and nearby cars. It felt almost symbolic of the chaos in Harry's life, as if the world outside was mirroring the storm he was going through. I was glad Harry had reached out to me that night. It gave me a chance to prepare for whatever might happen next. After that conversation at the bar, I began to notice a change in Harry. His motivation seemed to be slipping. He started showing up at work less often, and when he did, he seemed increasingly detached from the business. His absence started to take a toll on the company. Our suppliers were responding more slowly, and we lost a few customers. Behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel. Then one day, after 5 consecutive days of Angela's absence from work, Harry called me and the other managers into his office. He had something shocking to reveal. Angela had been working to undermine the business, using her connections to secure suppliers and clients for her own side venture. Harry feared major fallout and warned us that we might have to lay off half of our staff. He instructed me to travel to China and Vietnam to secure new suppliers while he focused on handling the damage with our customers. After the meeting, Harry pulled me aside. He admitted that I had been right all along. Since our conversation at the bar, something had been eating at him. He had installed a monitoring app on Angela's phone, and what he found was devastating. Angela had been involved with multiple men she met on WeChat. One of them had even proposed to her, and she had accepted. They were planning to move in together, start a business, and eventually use Angela's U.S. citizenship, something she'd gained through Harry, to bring the man to the States. The messages revealed that Angela had known this man long before she met Harry, possibly even before she moved to the U.S. Worse still, she was plotting to divorce Harry, take control of the business, and start over with her new partner. Her plan had been to wait 5 months before filing for divorce, but Harry's discovery threw everything into chaos. Angela abruptly stopped coming to work, and it became clear that her so-called business trips had been more than just professional engagements. Harry was heartbroken. He confessed that Angela had agreed to marriage counseling and even encouraged him to seek individual therapy, while secretly planning their separation. He admitted to feeling deeply depressed. As he spoke, he broke down, and I did my best to comfort him. It was clear that Harry had been bottling up his pain for a long time. I asked about his daughter and whether Angela's parents were still living in their house. Harry told me they had finally left, and he'd hired a babysitter for his daughter. But Angela, on the other hand, had completely gone off the grid. She wasn't answering Harry's calls or messages. To make matters worse, she had been contacting Harry's suppliers and customers, trying to sabotage the business by spreading false information and leaking sensitive documents. Fortunately, some loyal customers tipped Harry off, and a few suppliers were swayed by the money, keeping ties intact. Angela's plan to destroy the business was slowly falling apart, but not without damage. She had managed to sabotage a few supplier relationships in China and Vietnam, but it wasn't enough to sink the business entirely. Harry sent me to China with a one-way ticket, unsure of when I'd be back. We were in survival mode, scrambling to keep things afloat while Angela continued her attempts to tear everything down. During the trip, I managed to restore some of our supply lines. Then, out of nowhere, Angela stopped contacting the suppliers. I couldn't understand why she'd given up so suddenly. But whatever the reason, it was a relief when I finally returned to the US. Took about a month to stabilize the business, but things eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy. However, Harry was never the same. He became more withdrawn, paranoid, and defensive. One day, I asked if he had heard anything about Angela. He looked at me suspiciously and said, "She abandoned me. And our daughter." It was a strange response, considering everything we'd been through. A few weeks later, one of our employees told me that a missing persons report had been filed for Angela. Her family claimed they hadn't heard from her in weeks and were worried about her whereabouts. I immediately called Harry, and he confirmed that Angela was missing. The police had questioned him, suspecting foul play. There was no evidence that she had returned to China, and since Harry was the last person known to have seen her, he became the prime suspect. Harry hadn't told the police about Angela's affair, fearing they might use it against him as a motive. He begged me not to mention anything about it either. At that point, I didn't suspect Harry's involvement, nor did I want to. Even if he had been involved, Angela's absence was better for my livelihood, and I was more than willing to keep my mouth shut. 3 months after Angela's disappearance was reported, I noticed a significant change in Harry. He started becoming more outgoing, reaching out to me more often and wanting to hang out. Our business was starting to recover, and I had traveled to East Asia a couple of times to secure our supply lines. I encouraged Harry to join me in social activities, introducing him to my family and taking him out with my military buddies, hoping he might meet someone new. During these outings, I avoided bringing up Angela. She was a thing of the past now. One evening, Harry confided in me about the ongoing situation with Angela's parents and her wealthy uncle. They were constantly in touch with the police, trying to have Harry arrested, claiming he was responsible for Angela's disappearance. However, there was no evidence of a crime, and Harry had been fully cooperative with the investigation. He had allowed the police access to his home and answered all their questions, except, of course, those about Angela's affair. From an outsider's perspective, their marriage had seemed solid. Neither of them had filed for divorce before Angela went missing. Then Harry dropped another bombshell. Angela had secretly taken out a substantial life insurance policy on him without his knowledge. This added a new layer of intrigue to the case, leaving everyone, including the police, puzzled. There was no clear motive for Harry to have harmed Angela, and the authorities were struggling to piece together any solid evidence that could connect him to her disappearance. The police questioned everyone at the company, including me and the other managers, searching for any leads. None of us were inclined to volunteer information that might implicate Harry. If the cops had known about Angela's attempts to sabotage the business, it might have given them a motive to pursue charges against Harry. But as far as we knew, the investigation was still grasping at straws. The case remained unsolved for about 5 months until Angela's family in China hired a private investigation team to dig deeper. This team started asking questions and talking to some of our Chinese employees, who eventually confessed that Angela had tried to persuade them to leave the company and join her new venture. They also spoke to some of Angela's friends, who revealed that she had been unhappy in her marriage and had expressed a desire to leave Harry. The private investigators gathered enough probable cause to catch the attention of local newspapers, likely funded by Angela's connections back in China. The papers began running stories about Angela's case, which put pressure on the police and the district attorney's office to take action. It wasn't long before the investigators unearthed more information, including records of Angela's travels, purchases, and transcripts of her conversations with various individuals, including her affair partner. The increased scrutiny put pressure on some of our employees, who were then brought in for questioning. Eventually, one of them let slip that, before Angela's disappearance, Harry had informed me and the other managers about her attempts to undermine the company. This revelation led to my trip to China to repair the damage. When the police called me in for interrogation, I had my lawyer present and refused to answer any questions that could incriminate me. They pushed hard, trying to pin something on me due to my close connection with Harry and Angela. The cops tried to intimidate me, calling me a suspect and an accessory to a crime. They even hinted that my decision to bring a lawyer was a sign of guilt. Part of me wondered if Harry had been involved in Angela's disappearance, but I wasn't about to entertain that thought publicly. Eventually, the police backed off. They couldn't get anything out of me, so they resorted to petty tactics, briefly arresting me, showing up at my workplace, trying to intimidate me with their presence. I didn't know all the details, but at some point, they managed to get a warrant to search Harry's house again and seized a few items. Pictures of Angela were plastered on bulletin boards all over town, and it was widely assumed that she was dead. The police began appealing to the public for information, offering a reward for tips. The investigation dragged on for another 6 months, with the media constantly hounding us at work, desperate for statements. The relentless attention wore on our employees, and we lost some good people because of it. But finally, after months of pressure, things began to settle down. I continued to spend time with Harry during this period. There was an unspoken understanding between us. We both knew I suspected his involvement in Angela's disappearance, but neither of us ever said it out loud. I rationalized my silence, telling myself that Angela had tried to sabotage everything I had worked for. The company, my livelihood, my family's well-being. Whatever had happened to her, she had brought it upon herself. After those 6 long months, the district attorney made the decision not to take the case to trial. The evidence against Harry was mostly circumstantial, with no solid proof to guarantee a conviction. They feared that pursuing the case with what they had might lead to an acquittal. And if new evidence came to light later, the whole thing could unravel. So, they placed it on the back burner, officially closed but still under investigation. The business began to bounce back. For a while, it seemed like we had weathered the worst of it. But a year later, while I was at the airport about to board an international flight, my wife called, practically yelling at me to turn on the local news. I tried to explain that I was at the airport, but she insisted on telling me herself. She told me that 2 weeks earlier, human remains had been discovered in a remote area, likely disturbed by animals. Among the findings was a skull, and dental records confirmed it belonged to Angela. My heart sank. I immediately canceled my travel plans and tried to reach Harry, but he wasn't answering his phone. A few hours later, Harry's lawyer reached out to me. He explained that Harry had been arrested. His bail was set at $300,000, and we posted it as soon as the judge allowed it. When I finally spoke with Harry, he confessed that Angela's death had been an accident. According to him, Angela had told him she was planning to leave him and take their daughter back to China. Things got heated, and during a scuffle, Angela hit her head against the wall and collapsed. Harry said that she regained consciousness but refused to go to the hospital. He helped her onto the couch, gave her a blanket, and left her to rest, hoping she would recover by morning. But when he checked on her the next day, she was dead. Blood had oozed from the back of her head. The coroner's report confirmed a minor skull fracture and blunt force trauma, but there was no definitive cause of death. Harry said he panicked, unsure of what to do. In the end, he made a choice that sealed his fate. After a lengthy trial, Harry was convicted of second-degree manslaughter, and the jury recommended a sentence of over 20 years in prison. As of now, he's served 3 months, and we're in the middle of an appeal. Harry transferred most of the business to me, and I've committed to supporting him financially while he's in prison. On top of that, I'm now tangled in a custody battle with Angela's parents, who are trying to adopt their 5-year-old granddaughter. Harry's daughter has grown close to my kids, and Harry wants her to be raised in our home, believing we can provide the loving environment she deserves. So here I am, juggling the business, legal battles, and the fallout from decisions that spiraled far beyond anything I ever imagined. The business is stable now, and financially we're thriving. I've managed to keep most of the staff motivated through the chaos, but the emotional weight of everything still lingers. It shapes how I approach my work, my family, and my relationships. The custody battle has been a nightmare. Angela's parents, along with her wealthy uncle, are fighting hard for custody. They argue that their granddaughter should be raised within their culture and family, citing Harry's conviction as proof that he can't provide a stable home, even from prison. I'm doing everything I can to convince the court otherwise. Harry's daughter has already bonded with my children, and my wife and I are committed to giving her the love and support she needs. It's a strange position to be in, fighting for a child who isn't mine by blood, but whom I feel a deep responsibility toward. She's innocent in all of this, caught in a web of betrayal, ambition, and tragedy. Harry, for all his faults, truly wants what's best for her, and I'll do everything I can to honor that. As for the business, it's become my lifeline, both financially and emotionally. The skills I've developed, the network I've built, and the lessons I've learned have given me a new sense of purpose. I owe much of that to Harry. Despite the complexities of our friendship, I think about him often, his intelligence, his loyalty, and how he put his trust in the wrong person. The man I knew years ago may have been naive, but he didn't deserve the betrayal that destroyed his life. There are moments when I reflect on the choices I've made, the lines I've crossed, and the secrets I've kept. I wonder if I could have done more to protect Harry or prevent Angela's schemes from escalating. But then I remind myself that life doesn't offer clear answers. Sometimes you just do the best you can with what you're given. Harry's daughter will grow up someday and learn the truth about her parents. When that time comes, I hope she'll see that, amid all the chaos, there were people who fought to give her a better future. And as for me, I'll continue walking the tightrope of responsibility and redemption, knowing that every decision I make now is for the sake of my family, Harry's legacy, and the little girl who deserves a chance at a normal life.